What follows are 25 of the most egregious, unsound, absurd, asinine, preposterous, confused, contradictory, disjointed, inchoate, muddled, fatuous, irrational, idiotic, humorous, false, phony, mistaken, fallacious, inadequate, invalid, deceptive, unintelligible, unbelievable, unconvincing, unscientific, unreasonable, incorrect, implausible, illogical, silly, irrelevant, nutty, specious, meaningless, and common creationist arguments. And of course, why they are wrong. Foundational bias. In foundational bias, you admit bias towards a certain conclusion, even before making an argument. Foundational bias is not based on evidence or logic, but is instead based upon personal preference and belief. Therefore, foundational bias opens the door to all logical fallacies. Foundational bias is usually unstated, and rarely declared as openly as Ken Ham in this next clip. Just remember, this man wants his ideas taught in classrooms.
Well, let me explain it this way. Let's use our biblical glasses. We're going to put on our biblical glasses, okay, like we talked about in other lectures. We're going to look at the world through our biblical glasses, and we're going to go into the Bible and look at biblical history. We're going to consider the event of Noah's Ark.
The straw man argument. A straw man argument is made when you construct a misrepresentation or oversimplification of your opponent's position. You then easily refute your constructed straw man, but you have not responded to the substance of your opponent's argument. This is perhaps the most commonly used creationist fallacy. Watch in the next clip as Kirk Cameron sets up a straw man argument against the Big Bang for Ray Comfort to then knock down.
What you're about to see was not planned. There was no script, there were no writers, there were no cameras, no production crew, no lighting, no graphic artists, and no editors. The entire program just happened. There was a big bang in our production studio. And here we are.
Could you believe that? Of course you couldn't. Nobody in his right mind could.
Hasty generalization. A hasty generalization attempts to reach beyond its grasp and draw major conclusions from a minor subset of data. Great claims necessitate great evidence. Creationist claims often make hasty generalizations, sometimes from a single case. In this next hasty generalization, a conclusion about the entire scientific community is drawn from a minority viewpoint. Google Project Steve for the tongue-in-cheek scientific response to this nonsense.
And in the scientific community, growing numbers of scholars are expressing doubts about Darwin's theory and calling for an open hearing for their views. More than 100 scientists, including scholars from Yale, Princeton, MIT, and the Smithsonian, signed on to a statement declaring that they were skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. The declaration ran as an ad in the prestigious New York Review of Books.
Argument from authority. An argument from authority involves setting up an expert on a subject. The fallacy is not made in merely having an expert, but instead in using their authority to exempt their statements from criticism and to validate their claims. Creationists will trot out any number of PhDs for this reason, but the most egregious and humorous is Kent Hovind's authority.
Dr. Hovind has his doctorate in education. He's great at explaining scientific principles. He taught science for 15 years and is an expert on this subject.
Ad hominem argument. An ad hominem argument consists of issuing an attack against the person making an argument instead of addressing the substance of the argument itself. It is the opposite of an argument from authority. Poor Chuck Darwin is often the target of the ad hominem argument, as seen in the next clip with Ken Ham. Please note that Darwin meant races to mean the equivalent of species.
Well, Charles Darwin wrote a book, and the title of the book was this: "In the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life." You see, Charles Darwin was a racist. I mean, because his evolutionary philosophy was inherently a racist philosophy.
Appeal to the majority. An appeal to the majority, also known as an ad populum argument, is made when an argument is asserted to be true because the majority of people believe it to be true. This is similar to an argument from authority. The fallacy is in assuming people's belief in a proposition somehow validates it. In a democracy, the majority elects their government. Yet it is important to realize the majority can never elect the truth. Truth exists independently of whether you believe in it or not.
Most Americans think the Earth is less than 10,000 years old and God made it.
Quote mining. Quote mining is the aberrant practice of searching through large volumes of literature or spoken word to mine out any quotes from opponents that may seemingly support your position. In most cases, the quote is clearly taken out of context in a deliberately planned campaign of disinformation. The most common example is Darwin's quote about the eye, but Stephen Jay Gould has begun to get his share. In the following clip, Gould is referring only to his theory of punctuated equilibrium. We sorely miss you, Dr. Gould. You can no longer eloquently defend your own words.
The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil records persists as the trade secret of paleontology.
Man on the Street Interview. A man on the street interview is a combination of an appeal to the majority and quote mining. It employs several logical fallacies, and frankly, the opinion or knowledge of a person randomly met on the street has absolutely nothing to do with rational debate. We like the kid in the next clip way more than we like Ray Comfort, but he obviously just got out of bed. I can't think of any transitional forms before breakfast either.
Can you give me any example of a transitional form, going from one kind of an animal to another kind?
Transitional form between one and another. Well, the thing is, it already is an animal, whatever it is. You mean like saying one that's halfway between this and this animal? Can't think of anything right off the moment.
Non sequitur. Meaning literally does not follow. A non sequitur is formally defined as any conclusion that does not follow from the premise or premises. We use non sequitur to specifically refer to arguments that do not follow from any logical train of thought. Often, no real connection exists from these non sequiturs to any version of reality. So who better than Kirk Cameron on the Bill O'Reilly Show to exhibit the paramount of logical disconnect? And now for something completely different.
Plus, Darwin said in order to prove evolution, which is the #1 alternative to God, you've got to be able to prove transitional forms, one animal transitioning into another. And all through the fossil record and life, we don't find one of these. A crocoduck. There's just nothing like it.
Red herring. A red herring is not so much a logical fallacy as a distraction technique. In response to an opponent's position, an irrelevant point is made. It can even be a valid point, but it does nothing to address the issue. The red herring is another common creationist tactic. Watch as John Pendleton dodges an argument about the age of natural fossils with a discussion of a boot.
Some say, well, you need a long period of time to make fossils. Well, there's lots of fossils out there. Here's one of my favorite ones. This is a cowboy boot. This was found in West Texas. And the right-hand image here, we see that the poor cowboy broke his leg, and his leg and foot stayed inside the boot. Now, they did a scan of the toe section. All 5 toe bones are in there. It's all fossilized. This was found in the 1980s.
Argument from personal incredulity. In this fallacy, one argues that because they do not personally find a premise to be likely or believable, it cannot be true, regardless of evidence. The fallacy lies in presenting one's beliefs about a proposition as evidence. In the next clip, Michael Behe presents his favorite argument from personal incredulity, the bacterial flagellum. Note how he presents no evidence other than his own belief.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called a bacterial flagellum with all of its parts in all of its glory. It had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor. And I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. that's designed. You know, that's no chance assemblage of parts.
Argument from ignorance. In this fallacy, an appeal to ignorance is made as one argues either that a premise is true only because it has not yet been proven false, or that a premise is false only because it has not yet been proven true. The God of the Gaps argument usually begins with an appeal to ignorance. The Orange Lady stumbles through an appeal to ignorance as she claims science has not yet given a good explanation for abiogenesis, which is true, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
How did life begin on Earth? Evolution tells to this question that life began on Earth with a single cell suddenly appears. But we know that there is no room for chance in nature. Not even a single person could ever build a single cell with the advanced technologies of 20th century.
Violation of the philosophy of science. This is one of our favorites. The most powerful tool to obtain truth about the natural world is the scientific method. However, science cannot be used to explain the truly supernatural. Whether or not you believe the supernatural exists, science makes no comment on the supernatural. Lee Strobel is the grand violator of the philosophy of science. First, he stated that science made him an atheist, and then he stated it made him believe in God. It can do neither. Get a spine, Lee.
Because I believe that by doing science, we find God.
Equivocation. An equivocation is the misleading use of a word with more than one meaning. In creationism arguments, the most common equivocation is the word theory. In science, theory means a logically coherent model well supported by evidence. In popular usage, the definition of theory is closer to conjecture or opinion. Do not confuse the two. We see here creationist fallacies are not limited to Christianity. This Islamic gentleman is also having difficulty understanding the meaning of the phrase, theory of evolution.
Sister posed the question, how can you reconcile the Quran with Darwin's theory of evolution? Sister, I have not come across any book which says fact of evolution. All the books say theory of evolution. There is no book I have come across saying fact of evolution.
False dichotomy. In a false dichotomy, two mutually exclusive options are set up as the only possible choices. Therefore, if one is true, the other must be untrue. The fallacy is that the options may not be mutually exclusive, or even related, and other choices may exist. Venom Fang X walks us through the classic evolution versus religion false dichotomy. And I vote this kid is 5-star creepy.
Some people might say that maybe God used evolution to get us here. Well, that's not the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible says that death came by man's sin. However, evolution says man came by death. Quite opposites. There's a stark contrast between the two, and only one is right, because they are diametrically opposites. In fact, that's proof in the Bible's favor, because if you take it at face value, it is a literal opposite of evolution in every way. In fact, you could come to the theory of evolution by simply looking at what the Bible says and then flipping it on its head.
Begging the question. Also known as circular reasoning, begging the question is a fallacy where your conclusion is implicitly or explicitly assumed in your premise. Therefore, the illusion of logic is presented when in fact no proof has been made. Begging the question can be very subtly done. In the next clip, notice how the questioner assumes somebody wound up the universe.
NASA scientist Robert Jastrow wrote, "The second law of thermodynamics applied to the cosmos indicates the universe is running down like a clock. If it is running down, there must have been a time when it was fully wound up. The next obvious question is, who wound it up?"
Tautology. A specialized form of begging the question, a tautology, occurs when the premise and conclusion of an argument are identical. While a tautology, like A equals A, is true, and the repeated statement may also be true, a tautology proves nothing outside of itself. The anthropic principle is a tautology leading to a false dichotomy. In the following clip, notice how the setup for the anthropic principle can be boiled down to, if things were different, then things would be different.
For example, if you didn't have something like gravity that pulled matter together, you would never get planets, you wouldn't get stars, you wouldn't get any complex organisms. If you didn't have the strong nuclear force, there would be nothing to hold protons and neutrons together in the nucleus. And so you wouldn't have any atoms, so no chemistry. If you didn't have the electromagnetic force, you would have no bonding between chemicals. You'd have no light, and the list goes on. So you need all these sorts of fundamental principles have to be in place in order for life to occur. Wipe out one of those principles, wipe out one of those laws, no life.
False premise. In a false premise fallacy, the conclusion of an argument is invalidated by an incorrect assumption in one of the premises. You can't build a house on a poor foundation. Foundational biases and ad hoc reasoning usually have a false premise at their base. Many false premises exist in creationist arguments, like a global flood occurred, evolution is incorrect, etc. But the most formalized example is the Kalam cosmological argument. The false premise is that the universe began to exist. We have no proof that the universe ever not existed.
It is called the Kalam cosmological argument.
The Kalam argument is deceptively simple in its formulation. It consists of basically 3 steps. Premise 1 is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being uncaused out of absolutely nothing. Premise 2 is that the universe began to exist. And the remarkable development that has occurred is that for the first time, we now have solid scientific evidence for the truth of that second premise, that the universe began to exist. And from those 2 premises, it follows logically, therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause of its existence.
Ad hoc reasoning. Ad hoc reasoning, meaning for this purpose, is done to salvage an argument that rests upon a shaky foundation. Ad hoc reasoning attempts to address unstable or invalid portions of a failed argument. It is often used to avoid re-evaluation of an argument's validity. Kent Hovind is the master of ad hoc reasoning. Of course, his ad hoc reasoning needs its own ad hoc reasoning, but that's part of the beauty. Listen to him try to explain the firmament.
Now, this is what is known as the canopy theory. I cannot prove this. I can just tell you what the Bible says. There was water above the atmosphere, and I'm going to believe the Bible until it's proven wrong. Okay? And I can't tell you what it was or how it was held up there. Some people think it was ice, and it was held up by the magnetic field of the Earth. Suspended, what's called the Meissner effect. You know, a magnet will float on top of another magnet. I don't know. Somehow there was water up there.
Slippery slope. A slippery slope argument states that accepting a certain argument will lead to a chain of events that culminate in an undesirable outcome. The validity of an argument is not addressed, only the imagined outcome. Here's Venom Fang X sliding us down his slippery slope of stupidity.
They'd rather believe that they came from monkeys and can act like animals. And that's why you have kids shooting up their schools, and you have kids doing drugs, and the whole society is falling apart because everyone believes that they came from monkeys, which came from earthworms, which came from slime.
Correlation implies causation. This fallacy states that because 2 events are correlated, there exists a cause and effect relationship. The 2 variables may be caused by a 3rd variable, or may be completely unrelated. An example of this fallacy is, atmospheric carbon dioxide and crime levels have both risen since 1950. Therefore, carbon dioxide causes crime. The following is also an example of an argument from verbosity, where many weak examples are given in quick succession to avoid closer scrutiny. That's Kent Hovind, more fallacies per minute, guaranteed.
Then in 1963, prayer was taken out of our school system. Anybody remember that with Madeleine Murray O'Hare? 1963 is when we saw a great rise in sexually transmitted diseases for kids 10 to 14 years of age. 1963 is when we began to see a rise in premarital sex for every age group. 1963 is when we saw a great rise in unwed birth rates for girls 10 to 14. Now, the birth rates are up 100%. Pregnancies are up over 500. The difference is being aborted. Right now, 1/3 of all the kids born in the hospitals are to a couple that's not married.
Creative math. Probability arguments employed by creationists often employ creative math, where they make it seem as if the odds of something occurring without creation are incredibly remote. This is essentially an elaborate straw man argument. The creative math argument sets up a straw man that assumes evolution somehow works through random chance. The process of natural selection is the opposite of random. But it's real funny to watch them struggle with their big numbers.
The simplest living cells require thousands of specialized proteins in order to function.
A number of scientists have tried to calculate the probability of life arising by chance. Sir Fred Hoyle, a British mathematician, using a supercomputer and the assistance of graduate students, estimated only the origin of the proteins of an amoeba, 2,000 of them, arising by chance. He estimated that the probability that the proteins of an amoeba could arise by chance is 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power.
A probability of 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power is absurdly small.
Moving the goalposts. When the rules to obtain satisfactory completion of a goal are changed just as they are about to be attained, it is referred to as moving the goalposts. The trick is you can never meet the goal when the goalposts are continuously moved. Kent Hovind's $250,000 challenge is an example of this. You will never win the money because he will change the rules at the last moment to make sure you do not. It's shameful. Give LEG the $250,000.
We offer $250,000 for anybody with any real empirical, testable, scientific evidence for evolution.
The people engaged in this kind of nonsense always set up the rules that you could never win the money.
Has you ever eaten a banana?
Oh, yeah, I eat all kinds of food, yeah. I eat a banana, that's proof we came from a rock. That's not proof of evolution.
Just plain nonsense. Sometimes the failure in logic defies easy explanation. Examples in this category usually require a massive disconnect from reality, and the result is just plain nonsense. And who else could so eloquently exemplify this category?
Dinosaurs were just big lizards that lived with Adam and Eve before the flood came. You know, there really was a fire-breathing dragon. You say, now, Brother Hovind, you don't believe in fire-breathing dragons, do you? Well, yeah, I do.
Outright lie. Not so much a logical fallacy. The outright lie is simply deception in its purest form. Truth is discarded as superfluous in this type of creationist argument. Many, many choices existed, so we went to the biggest and boldest creationist lie of all time.
That biology is now entering what can only be described as a revolution, because the evidence is so overwhelmingly against the conventional neo-Darwinian view.
Hopefully, now that you're aware of the logical flaws in these arguments, they will not work any longer, and creationists will cease using them. But in the meantime, look for these types of arguments in creationist publications, in popular media, and in your daily life. Consider this your vaccination against idiocy.